Why don't you join me in Luke chapter 5? We're going to read the first 11 verses. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of those boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I'll let down the nets. And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and to help them. They came and filled the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and they followed him. It's probably been just a few weeks since Jesus first had an encounter with Peter. The Gospel of John actually tells us that Peter had first been introduced to Jesus by his brother Andrew. And we also see I believe it's in the prior chapter. Anyways, there were some healings that were taking place, and so as I kind of examined some of this information, I realized something that I really hadn't noticed before, and that is that up until this point in Luke, Peter had been kind of a part-timer. He knew Jesus, potentially saw him or spent a little time with him, but his relationship was just casual, uncommitted, and it was just different. And, I can kind of picture him listening to Jesus for a while, possibly, and going back to work, and kind of like we tend to listen in our society today to podcasts. We just kind of put them on in the background, and we only really catch a very little bit of what's being talked about. I kind of view that as possibly what Peter was like for some time. If Jesus would have needed anything, he could have come to Peter. He would have jumped right into it. The other way around as well. If Peter needed anything, he could have come to Jesus. But there was just something different about their relationship until now, and things kind of start to get interesting pretty quickly for the two of them. And so a crowd has gathered, and they're looking to listen to Jesus, and they have heard of him, and his notoriety is beginning to climb, and they're really beginning to pay more attention to the words that he's speaking, to the point to where it was way too full for him to even be able to speak on land. And so he hops in this boat and he goes out a little bit. Now, when you begin to understand how sound waves work, the water would always act as an amplifier, just like it does today. But that's how things happened. And so whenever things would get a little too crowded, whenever it would be hard for people to hear, they would try to have their back to the water, because the sound waves would go back, it would hit the water, and it would come back out. And so it was a natural thing. Even when you go to any of we call them amphitheaters. In Israel, they call them theaters. And so if you go to a theater, it has thousands and thousands of seats. It's all obviously stone, but they have all of these seats in this amphitheater type setting, and behind every one of them is water. And so even with it being difficult when they would have a play of some kind, it's kind of humorous. But if you were in a play and you were someone who was going through a difficult time or you were sad, you would have your lines to say, but you would wear a mask that had the face of someone who was sad. So people would be able to see, okay, they would have a little more context. If you were evil in the play, they had a mask that you would put over your face that was an evil-looking mask, probably just a red face. I don't know. But that's what they would do. And when we were in Israel, that's what they were discussing. We went to this theater, and they began talking about this, and it was unbelievable. I've talked about this several times. You probably get sick of hearing it, or maybe you forget about it, or maybe you're like Doc and you just don't listen. Could be. But we were at this amphitheater in Capernaum, I think. And as we're sitting there, they sent us all the way to the top row. And this place had thousands of seats. And they said, go to the very top row and just sit down. And our tour guide then goes down onto the stage and begins talking to us. He's talking to us like I'm talking to you. Obviously not mic'd up, but he was not yelling. He was just very calmly giving us the history of that specific amphitheater, and we heard every word that he said. Water is a natural amplifier. And so that's part of the reason why he recognizes in this moment that there are too many people to be present. And so they're crowding in on him. And so he gets in this boat, he goes out, and he begins speaking to the multitude. And, it happens to be Simon's boat. And so he asks them to put it out into the water. And so Jesus preaches a little more, and the crowds eventually go home, and they say that, this was about midday. At this point, Jesus looks at Peter, and he says, go out into the water. We're in the middle of Israel, which means it's hot. What is good about fishing when it's really hot? Nothing. There's nothing good about fishing when it's really hot. Do the fish bite, Dad? No. That's true. Yeah, when it's hot, they don't bite. And I was actually talking to a guy who we met him when we were down in Punta Cana. And he has a fishing business on the side. And I don't know if this is completely accurate, but he said it with a lot of confidence, and so I believe him. He said when it's really hot, the reason fish don't bite is they go into the depth of the water and they feed on the bottom. So they're not present where the bait is that you're throwing into the water. They're too deep. And so they're midday. Jesus says, go out, take your boat into the deep water, and let your nets down. He's saying this to a professional fisherman who had been out all night, hadn't caught a thing. Now, there's all kinds of reasons that Peter could have easily given for not doing this. First of all, Jesus, you're not a fisherman. You're a preacher. You're a teacher. This is what you are. In other words, don't tell me how to do my job. You're a nice guy. But when it comes to fishing, leave it to the professionals, right? Could have been one of the excuses he gave. Or he could have simply said, Jesus, it's hot out here. It's midday. I know, the fish aren't going to bite midday. They're not going to be present. They're not going to be caught. By the way, Jesus, my partners and I, we've been out all night. We're tired. This is when we go home. This is when we rest. But Peter doesn't really battle with them. He doesn't really make fun of Jesus for infringing on his time. I mean, after all, Jesus really isn't the type of friend you'd want to make fun of. He doesn't do any of that. He just kind of looks at Jesus and he's like, you know what? I've been out all night. I'm kind of tired, but if you're asking me to do this, I guess I'll do it. What can it possibly hurt? So he puts out into the deep water. He lets down his net. Something miraculous begins to happen. He can barely get the net back up. He needs help from other people. So Peter and his friends, at this point, they're all astonished by the amount of fish that they've brought in, probably going to cover a good amount of the season for sure. Peter falls to his knees and he declares himself to be a sinner. It says at the end of the passage that when they get back to land, they left everything and they followed him. One of the things that kind of hit my mind when I was looking over this, something that I really hadn't considered before. What happened to the fish? I don't know why I never thought about that before. I mean, it's pretty clear that they caught enough fish to fill 2 boats. And at the end of this passage, it literally says, and when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. They didn't even care about the catch anymore. Isn't it interesting that they were professional fishermen? This was their livelihood. This is what they did. And yet when they catch the biggest haul of their entire life, they just leave it all behind. That's the kind of power that God has. They went from talking about Jesus to literally fishing with him. And it kind of makes me wonder if and obviously we don't see this, but I wonder if Jesus ever asked them at this point, so are you going to talk or are you going to fish? Which one? Are you going to do what I'm asking you to do, or are you just going to sit there and talk? And I think essentially that's kind of the question that he asks us. Are you going to talk or are you going to fish? Because up until this point, really, their discussions with Christ, that's literally all it was. It was all talk. But on this day, Jesus begins to push them from just talk to action. He's using this whole experience to draw them into something deeper. He's looking for them to figure out exactly what he's wanting for them. And so he challenges them to a different kind of fishing than they'd ever done before. I think this is pretty important for us because, the reality is, some of us, Jesus is asking that same question. Are you going to talk or are you going to fish? Some of us, we say we're just going to talk because we struggle believing the compliments that people give us. We struggle with our self-esteem. We struggle with believing that we're beautiful in the eyes of God. But the reality is, fulfilling the work of our Father, beginning to go deeper into the water to become fishers of men, because if this is all important, because if we fulfill God's work, that is where we find satisfaction. That's where satisfaction is at. It's not in anything of the world. That's instant gratification. It's not satisfaction. And so for a lot of the world who struggles with this, if they would just hear the voice of God and follow the voice of God, satisfaction comes along. And there's nothing like completing that God-given task. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like having that conversation with somebody about God. There's nothing like stepping out of our comfort zone and helping others find him. So the question is, why is this so important? Well, this is important because inevitably there is someone who's waiting in the deeper water looking for a king. There's somebody out there. I'm sure Peter had no idea when Jesus jumped into his boat, first of all, that he was going to ask him to go back out into the water. And then even after he begins to go out into the water, I can't imagine Peter's getting in the boat thinking to himself, oh boy, I'm about to see something pretty cool. And then even when he says, drop your nets. He says, put out into the deep, let down your nets for a catch. Peter, Simon, answers, Master, we've toiled all night and we took nothing. We've been out here. We know where the fish are. We know what we're looking for. We know the optimal place. We know the optimal time. We know exactly where we should be, when we should be there, and where the fish are going to be. We've been out here fighting this all night. But if you say so, you have to wonder if there wasn't a little bit of an eye roll in that. I'd imagine, knowing Peter like we do, could have been a little bit of an eye roll. All right. Because you know everything, right? I suppose I'll do this. But I think this idea of being fishers of men is important because there is inevitably someone who's wading in the deep and they're looking for something better. And if God says, get in your boat and go, we get in the boat and go. If he says to throw your nets out, even if you've been throwing your nets out for years and nothing has caught, you throw your nets out again. Because he ultimately knows he knows what's out there, and he's asking for us to be a part of his plan. There's no guarantee, right? There's no guarantee. There's no promise that if you throw your nets out, if you give that person that you love, if you let them know about Christ, there's no guarantee that they're going to jump into the net. But Jesus is simply asking us, are we going to talk or are we going to fish? Which one is it? Are we going to be about what the world wants or are we going to be about what he wants? And I think for Christians too often we forget that we are supposed to be fishers of men. We aren't supposed to be keepers of the aquarium. I don't think there's anything wrong with being with keeping the aquarium. I think it's a good idea because we don't want the fish to die. But I think keeping the aquarium is secondary. Fishing is the most important. Being in the water, catching. And I think for Peter, it took an experience with Jesus to understand what this is all about. And I think there are people in our world who are wanting that experience with Christ. They just don't know it. I believe it. I believe with all of my heart that there are people in this world who are literally seeking it. They just don't know what they're seeking. It's just like children, right? We oftentimes think that kids just want freedom and want to run and want to do everything that they want to do, when in reality, what kids most desperately desire is the last thing they would ever expect. Kids actually do want structure. I worked in the school system for a year in an emotional support classroom with kids who were in preschool all the way up until 6th grade. Kids who had anger issues. Kids who would use language that I had never even heard from an adult. And some of these kids were 4 years old. And you sit in these classrooms and you think to yourself, it's a kid. When I was a kid, all I wanted to do was just have freedom and run and enjoy life. Ultimately, kids are looking for structure. Children want a safe space to be. Adults are actually looking for something that Christ offers. Even in a world where the idea of acceptance is promoted, there's no such thing as acceptance in society. There's just not. I went to the grocery store yesterday, and I'm checking out, and I literally couldn't believe my ears when I overheard a conversation between two of the employees. These two employees both admitted, so this just makes no sense to me. They both admitted in this conversation, this 30-second conversation that I overheard as they're checking me out, they're both homosexuals. And neither of them could stand the other one because they were homosexual. And I'm standing there in line, and all I did was grabbed my wallet out and started playing with my wallet, because I thought, this is really uncomfortable. That was honest to goodness the conversation they were having. And the one looked at the other and said, well, you're just a homophobe. And the one looked at the other one and said, yep, you're right. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? This is coming from the people of the world who claim that everyone should be accepting. There is no such thing in our society as acceptance unless you completely agree with me all the time. You disagree with me, I'm not going to accept you. You disagree with me, I'm going to cancel you. You say something that is wrong, I will make sure that everyone turns their back on you. And that comes from the very same people who cry for this idea of acceptance. People truly are looking to be accepted, and where are they going to go to find it? Not to society. They're going to experience acceptance at the arms of Christ. But he's not going to accept them and say, hey, you're good as you are. Things are going to have to change. But if you're looking for acceptance, you won't find it in the world. You will only find it through Christ. Some Christians just live our lives scared of what may be around the corner. People in the world can live scared about what's around the corner. But we need to experience the full effect of Christ. And we're not going to experience that if we only focus on the areas of our own lives where we fall short. If we only focus on the areas where we fall short, we just see ourselves as something that is completely contrary to the way God sees us. I used the statement in a few messages, a while ago, when we listen to the words of Satan. Don't listen to the words of Satan. Listen to what God is calling you. He does not call you a failure. That's not what he calls you. He calls you a son. He calls you a daughter. That's what we are to Christ. And for the people of this world who appear to be looking for something, they're not just going to turn to Christ immediately. Maybe we're one of the privileged ones that get that conversation with them, but they are looking for something. And they are in the deep. And if all we do is stay on the shore, no one's going to reach them. And then here's the worst part. Their blood, it's on our hands. Some of us will look at the idea of communicating with someone about Christ or trying to lead them to Christ, and they'll say, I can't do that because I'm scared of rejection. Well, you could also look at it as, if you don't, their blood's on your hands. I don't want to go to heaven and I don't want to go to get to Judgment Day and have to stand there before God and him look at my hands and my hands are just dripping in blood because I was unwilling to communicate about the truth of Christ. I don't want that. I'm sure ultimately you don't want that. We don't want to go to God and have him look at us and say, you fell short. So don't focus on the areas where you do fall short. Focus on the areas where God has blessed you, because he's given us all different kinds of talents. And he hasn't given them to us for our own glory. They're to be used because God knows that there are people who we can reach with our talents. I don't care what that talent is. I don't. He can use it. But I think sometimes as well for Christians, I think one of the issues is we sometimes forget why we exist. It's important for worship on Sundays, yes. It's important to be in Sunday school, yes. It's important to be in Bible studies, yes. But we forget that our primary objective is doing what Christ has called us to do. And our primary objective is not standing still or walking around Samaria or standing on the shore. Our primary objective is to fulfill the will of our Father. Our primary objective is going through Samaria. It's going into the deep water and dropping our nets. That's our purpose here. But so many are just, they're scared, they're concerned, and they're just worried about the idea of drowning. The idea of going out into that water. And I think even with this passage, what's the actual command that Jesus gives them, even in this passage? I'll wait until somebody can give me the answer. What's the actual command that he gives? Okay. Yep. Make disciples is the ultimate the ultimate call on us. What about this specific passage in the literal term? Because you're absolutely right. Making disciples is catching the fish, right? Yes, absolutely. What is the legit call to action that he gives to Peter in this? Go out, and then one more. Drop your nets. What is not the call that he gave to Peter? It's kind of interesting to me. Yeah, it's not stay on the shore. And believe it or not, Jesus doesn't even say, catch the fish. He says, drop your nets. What is that about? Throw your seeds, right? Get the information out there. That's the actual call that he has for Peter in this moment. Drop your nets. He's telling Peter to do the same thing he's been doing. He's telling you and me, do the same thing you've been doing. Get out into the deep. Stop standing on the shore. Throw your nets into the water. Sometimes, you know what we have to do? We just have to obey.
Kind of telling you to go do it when you don't want to do it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And every one of us in this room have had moments where we haven't wanted to do it, right? But that's real obedience. Peter didn't want to do it. He didn't want to throw the nets again. We've been out here all night, man. These weren't for the faint of heart. This wasn't one of those fishing nets that you see now that's on the end of a pole that, fits one fish in it, and as the fish comes in, you scoop it up with this net. It's not like one of those. This is a big, heavy, hard net to deal with. They didn't want to do it. But he just continues to tell them, throw out the net. Put it in the water. And here's what we do as Christians. We let him dictate the fish. We throw the net. That's what we do. But if we focus on our struggles, if we focus on those areas where we fail, I promise you, those nets will not hit the water. And the reality is, our feet probably aren't going to be on the boat. Every one of us have, I don't care who you are in this world, every single person has talents and they have insecurities. It's a part of being a human being. Question is, which one are we going to focus on? Are we going to focus on our insecurities and come up with excuses as to why the nets aren't going to leave the boat? Or are we going to say, you know what, God, you've blessed me in this area. How do you want me to impact your kingdom in this? How do you want me to impact your kingdom while I'm working on computers? Or I'm running payroll? Or I'm planting my flowers? Or I'm working in the kitchen? Or I'm sending somebody out to work on a power line? Or I'm pulling somebody over for speeding? How do you want me to cast my net? How do you want me to be obedient to you in this moment? I think the most significant thing about inviting people to Christ is that Jesus is not necessarily looking for the outcome. He's just simply looking for obedience. He's just looking for us to say, you're right. And like Greg said, even when you don't want to. I know that in the coming weeks, I'm going to have some uncomfortable conversations with people. Because I know without a shadow of a doubt that God is telling me you need to throw out the net. It's going to be uncomfortable, liable to create some problems. My knees are already shaking thinking about it. We've just got to be obedient. Be in the Word. Be in prayer. Be focused on God. Be focused on the fish, and they will come. But here's the thing. Our nets have to be in the water. If they're not, the fish are just going to swim right on by. And we're going to miss those opportunities. There's no possible way that I'm going to be able to get much further on this tonight. So we will pick this up next Sunday evening. Why don't you go ahead and stand with me, and we'll close.